Hi, how are you? I'm good. I'm doing good. Can you believe we're doing this? This is how we're living these days.
I know. It's wild. Who would have ever thought? I want to thank you so much for hopping on today to bond with me as we hopefully instigate thought on this life topic that is very much worth contemplating, which is looking into the world of eating disorders. And so I just want to thank you so much, Terry, for giving me your time to discuss this issue, and hopefully it will bless and heal and maybe even free some viewers that are watching as they dive in with us.
I hope so. Thank you so much for having me. You know, this is just near and dear to my heart. There are mental health issues. Mental wellness is just so important in my life, just because my life has been touched by so many of these issues. Mm-hmm. And so thank you for the opportunity to talk about it, because I think the main thing we can do is tell our story. Yes. Because when we tell our story, then it helps others either have the courage to tell their own story, or they may go, hey, that sounds like me, and maybe I can get some help for this, because I'm not necessarily doing this by myself very well.
I love that you said we have a story for a reason. We've been through what we've been through for a reason, and it really isn't intended for us to keep to ourselves. It's meant to be shared so that you're right, so others can relate to us and hopefully receive healing that we've received in freedom, maybe even avoid some pitfalls that we've been through ourselves. And so that being said, I wanted to talk about By Their Side, which is a book that I was given, and I've been thumbing through it. I wanted to ask you about, how did this come about? How did this begin? And a little bit about the book.
Well, it's unusual and probably one of a kind, mainly because this is a compilation of voices. This is Laura Lynn Bell is the named author of this book. However, that name is the voice and the stories and the life of over 40 writers in this book. And I happen to participate, and I have a section in the book mainly because I am a mental health advocate, and I am a public speaker. I am also an attorney who deals with clients who have mental health issues and substance use disorder. And we know that people's life experiences can definitely trigger all kinds of coping mechanisms. Yeah. And one of those coping mechanisms is oftentimes it manifests in an eating disorder. Mm-hmm. And so it is important. What I have found when we started this is somebody told me one time, because I've lived in the shadows of secrecy and shame all of my life for one reason or another. And a very wise person one time said, Terry, the truth will set you free. Mm-hmm. And so at that point, I started working, and it didn't happen overnight. I started working very hard with professionals and helping to deal with my own shame, my own guilt as a mother of missing things that I didn't know what I didn't know. Mm-hmm. And I didn't know what to look for. I didn't know the language that people speak when they're depressed or anxious, or when they manifest into an eating disorder. Right. I didn't know what I didn't know. So I felt like I needed to educate myself, because I've had life experiences that unfortunately have brought me to this place, fortunately or unfortunately. You know, I always think that there is an island of opportunity in the middle of any difficulty. And so it just depends on what we decide what we want to do with this. Right. And for me, there had to be a purpose for the suffering.
Mm-hmm. Can you share with us what you are referring to, and also signs that we can be looking for as parents, as friends, as mothers, especially at this time during COVID?
Give you a little bit of my background. I grew up in a household that had a lot of chaos. So I grew up, that became my normal. And when I married a wonderful man. But what I didn't know is that he also suffered from depression and a substance use disorder, specifically alcoholism. And and I had 4 little girls in 5 years. And so we had an incredible amount of chaos.
And there were no twins in there.
No twins. Woo! 4 and 5. When I tell you I'm an adrenaline junkie and I'm addicted to chaos, that's all you need to know.
Okay,
is
perfect.
That I had 4 kids in 5 years.
Have you gone skydiving?
No, and I'm afraid to skydive.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's my sidebar. Okay, we're back.
But at any rate, so what I have learned about the disorders, whatever the disorder is, the disorder gets in the way of relationships. And and it's so slow and insidious that you don't always recognize what is going on, because if it were overnight, like this COVID-19, and all of a sudden we had to shut down, bam, okay, we'll address it. Mm-hmm. But oftentimes with the disorders and the illnesses and the mental illnesses, it's very slow and very insidious, and I don't mean that in a judgmental way. I just mean it can be life destroying, and we don't even realize it's destroying our life. So I had the experience with a substance use disorder and then depression, and I unfortunately, the depression led to suicides in my family. My former husband died by suicide, and then 9 years later, my youngest daughter, my 14-year-old, also died by suicide, by depression, really, actually. So this is what I have experienced along the way. And then when I decided I really wanted to be a part of this incredible project with this book and the workbook to help educate people on an eating disorder, how to not only take care of yourself, but to take care of your loved one and what to look for and then what to do. Mm-hmm. I submitted an entry into the book, and I'm going to read just a little bit of it. Perfect. If I can.
Yes.
What a controlling, conflicting, confusing relationship humans have with food and body image. It is a love affair, a battle of wills, a best friend, a worst enemy, and a force that can take us to our knees. That's what it has done to me. It has taken me to my knees. This is a difficult piece to write, although I regularly write about coping with difficult topics like depression, substance abuse, addiction, and suicide. I admit that I am almost speechless when addressing the topics of eating disorder. For weeks, I have contemplated why this topic is so difficult, and the conclusion I have drawn is that eating disorders are the beast of all mental health issues.
Wow.
Obviously, I would not be contributing to this book if I had not been directly affected by an eating disorder. What happened to the stripped down purpose of food as fuel for our bodies? What happened to self-love? For me, it became a tangled mess of biology, psychology, and distorted thought. When you experience incredible loss and trauma, it triggers chemicals in your brain, needless to say, that sometimes the way you cope with that is feelings are very powerful energy in our body. And because oftentimes we don't know how to deal with that energy that is flowing through our body, we will develop coping mechanisms that either helps us deal with those emotions or not deal with the emotions. And oftentimes it can manifest in depression, or it can manifest in anxiety. It can substance use or abuse of food. And that is oftentimes a coping mechanism for people who've experienced traumatic experiences in their life. Mm-hmm. And, having 4 little girls and a person, full disclosure, my perception and my relationship with food was also skewed. And it has been all my life. And I just really felt like my body image was who I was. Mm-hmm. That is what I was. That's what I thought people thought of me. And if I, for whatever reason, didn't live up to that perfectionistic perception of myself, then I began to tell myself all kinds of negative messages. And so, I have 4 little girls, and they've experienced an incredible traumatic event when their father died. And what was even worse is that their father, first of all, we told no one what was going on in our household because we were afraid it would affect his career. So we lived in the shadows of shame. And so we just dealt with it not in a very healthy way. I didn't even ask for help from a therapist. I didn't go to any peer support groups. I did nothing because I was afraid it would ruin his career. So you have all this untreated mental illness and substance use disorder going on in this household. And then former husband was a public official. And so when he got to the point where he decided he was not going to live any longer, he came into my bedroom and he took his life while our 4 girls were sleeping. And so he was a public official, and the news media went live from our front yard. So there was no way to hide. I mean, there was no way to say, okay, I'm going to claim this was something completely different than depression and substance use disorder. I'm going to call it a heart attack, or I'm going to call it whatever. There was no place to hide. So that means you've got 4 little girls, and at the time they were 10, 8, 6, and barely 5, who have experienced one of the most difficult things a person could ever experience. And what I've learned about myself is to stay okay. There has to be purpose for the suffering. There has to be. And for me, that meant I'm going to talk about these issues so that no one else will have to go through this, or hopefully help someone who is going through this. And what I didn't know, though, is that how that trauma was manifesting in my children. I didn't know that each one of them had suffered from their own depression, and that's what happens with suicide, the survivors. And I say we're the survivors with a capital S. We're the ones who are left behind. Right. And oftentimes when survivors are left, they experience their own depression. And so I was aware of that, but I didn't know what I didn't know, and I didn't know how it was manifesting in my girls. The shocking thing is that I began to realize later on that one of my daughters, she was pulling away.
I'm just so thankful that you're sharing your story. And like you were saying earlier, we're meant to share it. And will you share with us one reason why it's important to share our stories?
When a person who's been through an immense tragic situation, whatever that looks like, when they get up and tell their story and the person who is listening thinks, wait a minute, that person has been through holy hell. Yeah. And if that person is up there standing and talking about this and talking about solutions and talking about recovery, then maybe it'll help. Maybe there's hope for me to walk through my hell, because there are so many people who are suffering, so many people who do it in isolation and alone. Yes. And just to get up and to listen to someone, even on a podcast or a Zoom video, to hear someone share their story, that gives them hope that maybe there is light at their end of their very dark tunnel. Yes. And it applies to people who are the caregivers, and it also applies to those who are struggling with the illnesses.
Right. If a mom is watching right now and listening, and she's maybe wrestling with whether or not her daughter is starting to isolate or withdraw, will you share with us some of the signs that you might have missed that you now know were signs with your daughter and husband?
Right. There is a language of depression, and I didn't know, and I didn't speak the language of depression. So I didn't know what I didn't know.
Right.
And so what I have learned is that people will show behavioral signs of depression, eating disorders, substance use disorders, and they will also speak the language. For example, my former husband was the district attorney, and he was trying a police shooter, a 17-year-old police shooter. And he had told me early on in our marriage that because he did not get the death penalty on that police shooter, he felt like dying because he had let everyone down. Well, my reaction, because my brain doesn't work that way, my reaction was, well, that's extreme.
Right.
But what he was doing is he was telegraphing. He was telling me where he was in his head. And so what I have learned along the way is that there are signs, and we have to learn to speak the language. And one of the things, if a parent is listening, I've got a list here, and I want to share it if I can.
Yes, absolutely.
Just for example, if it feels like your child has been attacked by the box snatchers, it's like, where has my kid gone? This is not the way my kid has been acting all of her life or his life. And it's like, where do they go? Then you go, you think, okay, let's do some investigation here. And if you see a child who becomes very manipulative, trying to control the situation, the way they want it, okay, they can become dishonest. The lies, they will oftentimes lie about maybe what they're doing and why they're isolating, or why they're not eating, or why they're eating what they're eating, or using. I mean, that is to be able to protect your habit. Oftentimes you have to lie.
Right.
So they don't reveal the full truth. They hide the truth. They become sneaky. They're secretive because they have to act out in privacy, because if the light shines on their behavior, then people are going to notice. So
Right.
they become very secretive, short-tempered, agitated, irritable, replies with short answers. Whereas you might have been able to have a conversation with your child and your daughter, your son, whatever, and all of a sudden they don't want to talk to you, and
Right.
they become very irritated and irritable.
And you're bugging them. Stop asking me all these questions. Yeah.
Right. I mean, your radar's going off, and pay attention to your radar. If they become disrespectful, rude.
So I want to pause you right there. I love what you said about paying attention to your radar, because I think as parents, moms, so often we want to negate that and say, oh, they're just going through a phase, or hormones, or a test at school, or stress. And then we kind of negate our own radar, right? We want
Right.
to justify or just, you know what, it's not a big deal. But you're saying everything you're highlighting are things to look for on a more consistent basis.
Correct. Yeah, that's the conundrum, especially during the teenage years, is
Right.
what is normal teenage behavior and what is not. And I remember asking myself, are these rages, is this normal teenage behavior? Because I didn't know.
Right.
And so there were things, or is this going in and shutting their door and completely isolating and not having anything to do with the family anymore? Well, is this just normal
Right.
teenage behavior? So we don't know.
Right.
And that's the benefit of this book and this workbook. It explains some of these signs and these signals and what this means, and then what you can do about it. But you're exactly right. You do not ignore the radar.
Right.
Your mother, father, your parental instinct is
Grandparents
your
might be noticing
absolutely
things, 'cause sometimes
friends.
they can see more than we can.
Yes, exactly. I mean, that is your biggest weapon, is your radar. And so
good.
don't ignore it. You know, if your child becomes very emotional, temperamental, reactionary, outside of the typical sensitivity like we were talking about with a teenager who knows, well, when it's a little bit over the top,
Right.
red flag.
Okay.
Volatile, quick to anger, emotionally and physically abusive. Teary, quick to cry. Weary, physically exhausted. Look for those circles under those eyes. I remember the very dark circles. It was an emotional drain, and they weren't sleeping at night, obviously, and you could see it in their face. Depressed, sad. Boy, I could talk hours on that. Heavy-hearted. Depression, by the way, is very, very common in eating disorders. Egocentric, obsessed with their eating disorder. Thus, their eating disorder is obsessed with them. They become selfish, self-centered. And anyone who's in the midst of an addiction, by the way, is self-centered and egocentric. Anxious. Anxiety is the most common characteristic of someone who is experiencing an eating disorder. And when you're anxious like that, and you've got hormones that are releasing in your brain constantly, that resistance can lead to persistence, which can lead to depression, which can lead to suicide ideation, which can lead to suicide. And, the suicide rate is increasing every year. And it is people who are in the midst of an eating disorder are at high risk of suicide.
Can you tell us, that being said, as far as where we are right now as a country, with lots of unknowns, unprecedented stress that young and old are feeling from not going back to school, not graduate? I mean, we could go on and on. What are you seeing out there as far as the eating disorders and how this stress and depression is impacting us right now as a whole?
There have been people who describe this pandemic in this way, that we have this first wave, and the first wave is a joint concern for our physical well-being and the number of lives it's going to take. And the second wave will be the mental health issue that will manifest after the first wave calms a little bit, or those initial fears abate a bit. Then the mental health issues are going to surface. And the deal with the shelter in place that is so dangerous for anyone who's struggling with depression or anxiety or their eating disorder or whatever is the isolation.
Right.
And isolation is the number one culprit to depression and suicide ideation. And loneliness is an affliction that one person can cure, and that is making contact with someone who is struggling. And I often tell people, I remind them to stop minding your own business. And I say that because oftentimes we feel like, I need to stay in my lane. I need to stay out of other people's business. But when you are struggling with an eating disorder or your depression or whatever, oftentimes you don't even realize the magnitude of the illness that you're dealing with. And it is an illness. It is not a choice. Do you think anyone would want to starve to death?
Right.
No, it is not a choice. Do you really think someone would want to drink themselves to death? It is not a choice. It is an illness that can be treated. And that's the message in the book as well, is that it can be treated. There is treatment, there's recovery. There are thousands and thousands of people who are in recovery. And so it doesn't have to end in the most tragic of ways.
Right.
But the bottom line is we must talk about it. We must provide crisis management services. And also this book, by the way, that does that, because what it does is it provides information and education. And there are also 15 professionals who are also in this book who talk about eating disorders. So it gives you that scientific information as well. But then there's the workbook where you can work through the book. And then the next thing you can do, there it is. Yeah. What you can do then is take that workbook to a therapist, to a professional who can help you. And you're way way ahead of the game if you've worked that workbook in trying to figure out exactly what to do, not only for yourself, but for your loved one who's experiencing the eating disorder.
Right.
But the suicide rate is increasing. Like I said, there's a second wave. There's a higher incidence of child abuse going on right now. Domestic violence is up. The rate of depression is already up. The thing we can do for each other is validate
Absolutely.
the person's feelings. If you do that, then you may relieve some of that suicidal pressure that is building in that person, and it validates them. They don't feel crazy.
That's right. And so as we're talking about just where we are now and people reaching out to you and me as well, I love that you said don't mind your own business, because there's been times where I've been really honest with friends or coworkers, people that I'm not that close to, where I've felt prompted to ask point blank questions. Why are you not returning my calls for 3 weeks? Are you holed up right now? And I've made some people mad by being honest and asking the hard questions. But you're telling us right now more than ever not to mind our own business. Ask the tough questions. Dive into people's lives that are isolating. Pay attention to that and make an extra effort, because we're needing it now more than ever.
That's exactly right. Step out of your comfort zone. And if nothing else, ask the person you're concerned about, you haven't heard from, who's not answering the phone, who's not returning texts, who is being very evasive. Those are classic signs of either hiding something or depression. Clearly, those are classic signs. Don't be afraid to ask, are you okay? And I'm going to tell you why.
Yes.
I have a friend who, when he was 19 years old, he suffered from bipolar disorder. And he had decided he couldn't live like that anymore. And so he also struggled with food. And it was a complex bundle of issues that he was dealing with. And he was tired and he was exhausted and he didn't want to live like that anymore. And so he decided he was going to jump off the Golden Gate Bridge. And as a mother of a child who died by suicide, I asked him, please tell me, what were you thinking? And he said some things that I'll never forget. One was, oftentimes when a person wants to die by suicide, they will make a pact with themselves. If this happens today, I won't die today, may die tomorrow, but I won't die today. And the pact that he made with himself the day he jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge was, if one person asks me if I'm okay, I won't jump off the Golden Gate Bridge.
Okay, I got the chills.
I know. It is unbelievable. And he goes through this story of his entire day of encountering people. He's 19 years old. He's crying. He's sobbing. He's thinking he's never going to see his parents again. He's on a city bus full of people and nobody asks him, are you okay? And he's standing at the bridge and he's about to jump. And this lady walked up to him. He said, I'll never forget her. She had this black hair and these gigantic Chanel sunglasses on. And he said, okay, she's going to ask me if I'm okay, and I won't have to jump today. But what she did is she said, hey, handed him a camera and said, will you take my picture? And he went, okay. So he took her picture, handed her back the camera, and he jumped. And he said, the thing that is the most important thing for anyone who is struggling with suicide ideation, whether that is you have an eating disorder that is wearing you out and you don't want to live like this anymore, or if you have depression and think, I just can't do this anymore, it's too exhausting, everybody would be better off without me. Let me tell you what he said. He said the minute he jumped, he regretted it. I don't want to die. Please, God, don't let me die. And he said he was so sad because he thought, I'm going to die and my family will not know that I wanted to live. And it took him 4 seconds to hit that water. And needless to say, he's one of 43 people to ever survive jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge. And he tells his story. And when he got through, I thought, we've got to stop minding our own business. Yeah. If one person had asked him, are you okay? He wouldn't have jumped. I never pass anyone now who's struggling, crying. And I work in a criminal courthouse, where it is not a happy place, believe me. And I will never walk by anyone who is crying or struggling. because I've always remembered if one person. So I want to be that one person.
Right.
And you can be that one person. And so we have to stop minding our own business. And you're right. It may make some people mad, but better mad than dead.
That's right.
Is what I say.
Right.
And remember, you can always dial 911 and get some help, or dial the Suicide Crisis Center helpline.
I wanted just to share, so by their side, I was looking through it. You will be tested. You will be pushed to what you think is your limit. At times you will break. Motherhood isn't a job. It is a part of who you are. I'm a mom. You will stumble and at times want to run away, but you won't. You will find you're resilient. And yes, you will second guess your wisdom. Am I doing this right? Am I equipping this special child with what they need to address this ever-changing world? As time passes, you'll realize it's not about molding your child into the person you think they should become. It's about finding out who they are, encouraging their strengths, and loving them through their weaknesses. You'll be surprised at how different the child from your womb seems, and those differences can cause you immeasurable anxiety. But you'll come to realize that your child is like you, and it's through the eyes of that child that you will learn about yourself and about life. A mom.
Everyone is on their own journey, and we have to be willing to allow them to walk that journey. Right. And we're hopefully going to be there to help them through it.
Yeah. But it goes into genetics and brain chemistry and predisposed cognitive vulnerability. Like, I love all this list is such a gift for everybody on the planet. And then I love that you go into temperaments again and describing how certain temperaments are going to contribute to how you handle certain things. And I love y'all talk about emotional intelligence. This book is jam-packed with such wisdom and knowledge for all of us, whether we're close to someone with eating disorders or addictions or depression, really anything we're wrestling with that's a hurt, habit, or hang-up. I feel like this is such a good book to offer tools and insight and to help us as caregivers and loved ones to love on those struggling around us. Then you're prepared. When you're going to see a therapist or a counselor, you've done a lot of the legwork already. You're taking the time to start now, working through the work.
That's right. A person who is experiencing this is totally terrified. I know that. And one thing you can do is pick up that book by their side, and that's going to help you. It's going to help you with that fear and that terror. And that's the main thing, is what can you do to help yourself? Read the book, work the workbook, because then you'll find some relief for yourself.
Where can we find the book and workbook?
You can go to bytheirsidebook.com.
Perfect. They both hope that whomever's watching that might need to read the book or wants to peruse the book, that you will go to bytheirside.com. Thank you so much for bonding with me today as we are covering this life topic that is definitely worth contemplating.